Spring 1847. Colorado Territory. Morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook when young Evangeline pressed her face against the cold window pane of the orphanage. At 8 years old, she had already been rejected by 7 families each time. The same whispered words followed her back to the gray stone building. That child ain't right in the head. What they didn't understand was that Evangeline's mind worked differently, seeing patterns where others saw chaos, finding comfort in routine where others craved change. Evangeline had arrived at the Millbrook orphanage 3 years prior, after a cholera outbreak claimed her parents during their westward journey. The matron, Mrs. Hawthorne, was a stern woman with graying hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent scowl. She ran the orphanage with military precision, expecting all children to conform to her rigid schedule and behavioral expectations. From the very beginning, Evangeline struggled to fit the mold. She would rock back and forth when upset, cover her ears during the noisy meal times, and often seemed lost in her own world. The other children learned to give her a wide berth, not out of cruelty, but out of confusion. They couldn't understand why she would line up her few possessions in perfect rows, or why she could recite entire passages from the Bible after hearing them just once, yet couldn't seem to follow simple social cues. That Evangeline child is touched, Mrs. Hawthorne would mutter to the visiting families. Sweet enough girl, mind you, but she's got peculiar ways. Might be too much of a burden for most folks. The first family to consider adopting Evangeline was the Millers, who owned the general store in town. They needed help with their young twins and thought an older child might be useful. Mrs. Miller, a plump woman with kind eyes, initially seemed charmed by Evangeline's quiet demeanor and obvious intelligence. She's quite bright, Mrs. Miller had observed during their first meeting. Look how she's arranged those wooden blocks. It's like a perfect little town. But within a week of the trial period, Evangeline was back at the orphanage. The twins had been too loud, too unpredictable when they knocked over her carefully arranged blocks. Evangeline had what Mrs. Hawthorne called one of her spells, sobbing uncontrollably and rocking in the corner until the chaos in her mind settled. We just can't handle her particular needs, Mrs. Miller had explained apologetically. The twins don't understand why she won't play with them, and when she gets upset, well, it upsets the whole household. The second family, the Johnsons, lasted only 3 days. They were wheat farmers who needed strong hands for the harvest. Evangeline's tendency to focus intensely on small details rather than completing broader tasks frustrated them. She would spend an hour perfectly arranging a small section of wheat stalks while leaving the rest of her assigned area untouched. She's not lazy, Mr. Johnson had told Mrs. Hawthorne. That's not the problem. She works harder than most adults when she sets her mind to something, but she can't seem to see the bigger picture. We need someone who can work steady and predictable like. Family after family came and went. The Hendersons returned her because she couldn't adapt to their large, boisterous household. The Coopers found her too quiet and withdrawn. The Washingtons worried she would be a bad influence on their own children, though they couldn't quite articulate why. Each rejection chipped away at Evangeline's already fragile sense of self-worth. She began to believe what she overheard in whispered conversations, that she was defective, broken, unwanted. She stopped trying to make friends with the other orphans and instead spent her days reading the few books available in the orphanage library, losing herself in stories of far-off places and different times. Mrs. Hawthorne, despite her stern exterior, genuinely cared for all the children in her charge. She watched Evangeline's spirit dimming with each failed placement and felt a deep sadness for the child. She knew Evangeline wasn't malicious or troublesome in the way some children could be. The girl was simply different, and in their small frontier town, different was often seen as dangerous or undesirable. There's got to be someone out there who can see past her peculiarities to the good heart underneath, Mrs. Hawthorne would say to her assistant, Miss Dorothy. That child has more compassion and intelligence than most adults I know. She just shows it different. The summer of 1847 was particularly difficult for Evangeline. 2 more families had tried to adopt her, and both had returned her within a month. The first, the Pratts, had been looking for a companion for their elderly mother, but Evangeline's need for routine clashed with the unpredictable demands of caring for someone with declining mental faculties. The second family, the Reeds, had wanted help with their new baby. Evangeline's sensitivity to the infant's crying had made her nearly useless as a helper, as she would have to leave the room whenever the baby became fussy. By autumn, Evangeline had developed a reputation throughout Millbrook as the strange child at the orphanage. People would point her out when she accompanied Mrs. Hawthorne on errands in town, whispering behind their hands about the girl who wasn't quite right. Some were cruel, suggesting she was cursed or possessed. Others were merely puzzled, unable to understand why a child who seemed so intelligent in some ways could be so challenging in others. Maybe she's just meant to stay here, Evangeline overheard Mrs. Hawthorne telling Miss Dorothy one evening. Maybe God has a different plan for her than we expected. The words cut deep. At 11 years old, Evangeline understood that most children left the orphanage by her age, either through adoption or by being old enough to work as hired help for local families. The idea that she might be trapped in the gray stone building forever filled her with a despair that seemed to settle in her bones. It was on a crisp October morning in 1847 that everything changed. Evangeline was in her usual spot by the window, watching the leaves swirl in the autumn wind, when she noticed a lone rider approaching the orphanage. The man was tall and lean, wearing a well-worn but clean coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He dismounted his horse with careful movements that spoke of either injury or advanced age, though from her vantage point, Evangeline couldn't tell which. The stranger's name was Josiah Thornfield, though Evangeline wouldn't learn this until later. He was 43 years old, though the hardships of frontier life had aged him beyond his years. His hair, once a rich brown, was now streaked with silver, and deep lines marked his weathered face. He had come to Colorado Territory 5 years earlier with his wife, Margaret, seeking a fresh start after crop failures had destroyed their farm in Ohio. Josiah and Margaret had built a modest but comfortable homestead about 15 miles outside of Millbrook. They raised cattle and horses, tended a large garden, and dreamed of filling their home with children. But after 3 miscarriages and years of trying, they had reluctantly accepted that biological children were not in their future. "We could adopt," Margaret had suggested during one of their many conversations about their childless state. "There are always children in need of homes." Josiah had been hesitant at first. He worried about his ability to be a good father, especially to a child who might have experienced trauma or loss. But Margaret's gentle persistence had eventually won him over, and they had begun discussing the possibility of visiting the orphanage in Millbrook. Their plans had been put on hold when Margaret fell ill during the harsh winter of 1846. What started as a simple cough had developed into pneumonia, and despite Josiah's desperate attempts to nurse her back to health, she had died in early spring, leaving him alone with his grief and their empty house for months after Margaret's death. Josiah had wandered through his daily routines like a man in a dream. He cared for his animals, tended his land, and maintained his property, but he felt hollow inside, as if the best part of himself had been buried with his wife. It was only when he found Margaret's journal, with its detailed notes about adoption and her hope for a child to love, that he began to consider visiting the orphanage. Maybe it's what she would have wanted, he had told himself as he saddled his horse that October morning. Maybe there's a child out there who needs a home as much as I need a family. Mrs. Hawthorne met Josiah at the door, her experienced eye taking in his clean but simple clothes, his respectful demeanor, and the genuine sadness that seemed to cling to him like morning mist. "I've come to inquire about adoption," Josiah said, removing his hat. "My wife, she passed this spring, but we had always talked about taking in a child. I thought maybe it was time to honor that dream." Mrs. Hawthorne invited him into her small office, where she kept the records of all the children in her care. As was her custom, she began by describing the younger children, the ones who were typically easier to place. "We have several lovely children who would make fine additions to any family," she began. "There's Timothy, he's 6, very energetic and eager to please, and little Martha, she's 4. sweet as pie and loves to help with cooking. But as Mrs. Hawthorne continued her descriptions, Josiah found his attention wandering to the window, where he could see a girl with dark hair sitting alone on a bench in the courtyard. She was reading a book, completely absorbed in its pages, oblivious to the other children playing nearby. "What about her?" Josiah asked. Nodding toward the window, Mrs. Hawthorne followed his gaze and sighed. "That's Evangeline. She's 11, been with us for 3 years now. I have to be honest with you, Mr. Thornfield, she's challenging. She's been placed with 7 different families, and none of them worked out." "What kind of challenging?" Josiah asked, still watching the girl. Mrs. Hawthorne chose her words carefully. "She's not like other children. She's very intelligent, don't get me wrong. She can read better than most adults and has a remarkable memory, but she has difficulties with social situations. She gets overwhelmed easily, needs things to stay the same, and can have what folks call fits when things don't go according to her expectations." Instead of being deterred, Josiah seemed intrigued. "Could I meet her?" Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated. She had grown fond of Evangeline over the years and didn't want to subject the girl to another failed placement, but there was something about Josiah's quiet manner that gave her hope. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt," she said finally. "But I want you to understand what you might be getting into. Evangeline requires patience and understanding. She's not going to be the kind of child who adapts quickly to new situations." Josiah nodded. "I'm not looking for easy, Mrs. Hawthorne. I'm looking for right." Mrs. Hawthorne led Josiah out to the courtyard, where Evangeline was still reading. The girl looked up as they approached, her dark eyes wary and guarded. "Evangeline," Mrs. Hawthorne said gently, "this is Mr. Thornfield. He'd like to talk with you for a few minutes." Evangeline closed her book carefully, using a pressed flower as a bookmark, and looked up at Josiah with the same intensity she had been giving her reading. "What kind of book is that?" Josiah asked, settling onto the bench beside her. "It's about plants," Evangeline said quietly. "How to identify them and what they're good for. Mrs. Hawthorne has 3 books about plants, and I've read them all 4 times each." "4 times each?" Josiah smiled. "You must have them memorized by now." "I do," Evangeline said matter-of-factly. "Would you like me to tell you about any particular plant?" For the next hour, Josiah listened as Evangeline shared her knowledge about medicinal herbs, wildflowers, and garden vegetables. He was struck by the depth of her knowledge and the passion in her voice when she spoke about something that interested her. He also noticed how she avoided eye contact, how she seemed to choose her words carefully, and how she grew quiet whenever other children came near. "Do you like plants because they're predictable?" Josiah asked eventually. Evangeline looked at him with surprise. No adult had ever asked her such a perceptive question. "Yes," she said simply. "Plants follow rules. If you give them the right soil and water and sun, they grow the way they're supposed to. People are harder to understand." Josiah nodded thoughtfully. "I have a large garden at my homestead, and I raise horses and cattle. Would you like to hear about them?" As Josiah described his property, Evangeline found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did with strangers. He spoke slowly and calmly, didn't interrupt her when she asked detailed questions, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. "Why do you want to adopt a child?" Evangeline asked suddenly, the question that had been weighing on her mind. Josiah was quiet for a long moment. "My wife died this past spring," he said finally. "We always wanted children, but it never happened for us. She used to say that maybe we were meant to love a child who needed a family, instead of having one of our own. I think she was right. What if the child doesn't fit in?" Evangeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'll figure out how to make room," Josiah said simply. "Sometimes the best families are the ones that don't look like what everyone expects." That evening, after Josiah had returned to his homestead, Mrs. Hawthorne found Evangeline still sitting on the bench, staring at the pressed flower she used as a bookmark. "What did you think of Mr. Thornfield?" Mrs. Hawthorne asked. "He didn't try to make me look at his eyes," Evangeline said, "and he listened to all my plant facts without getting bored. Would you like to visit his homestead? See if you might want to stay there?" Evangeline was quiet for so long that Mrs. Hawthorne thought she might not answer. Finally, she nodded. "I think I would like that," she said. The following week, Josiah returned to the orphanage to take Evangeline for a visit to his homestead. The 15-mile journey took most of the morning, with Evangeline riding behind him on his gentle mare, Patience. As they traveled, Josiah pointed out various landmarks and shared stories about the area. He told her about the creek that ran through his property, the stand of cottonwood trees where Margaret used to like to sit and read, and the mountain peaks that could be seen from their front porch. "Do you ever get lonely living so far from town?" Evangeline asked. "Sometimes," Josiah admitted, "but I've got my animals for company, and there's something peaceful about the quiet." "Do you think you'd mind the solitude?" "I like quiet," Evangeline said. "Sometimes the orphanage gets too loud, and I have to hide in the pantry until my head stops hurting." When they arrived at the homestead, Evangeline was struck by how neat and orderly everything appeared. The house was small but well maintained, with a wraparound porch and large windows that let in plenty of light. The barn and outbuildings were painted and in good repair, and the garden, though dormant for winter, showed signs of careful tending. "Margaret planned this garden," Josiah said as he showed Evangeline around. "She drew diagrams of where everything should go, what plants would grow well together, when to plant and harvest everything. I've been trying to keep it up the way she would have wanted." Evangeline studied the garden layout with the same intensity she brought to everything that interested her. "She was very smart," she said finally. "This is arranged perfectly for the different growing seasons and water needs inside the house." Evangeline was impressed by the bookshelves that lined the walls of the main room. There were more books than she had ever seen in one place outside of the small collection at the orphanage. "Margaret was a teacher back in Ohio," Josiah explained. "She collected books wherever we went. Always said a house wasn't a home without plenty of books. Could I read them?" Evangeline asked, running her fingers along the spines. "Of course, that's what they're for the rest of the day." Josiah showed Evangeline around the property. She met his horses, including a young colt named Thunder, who seemed particularly drawn to her quiet presence. She learned about caring for the cattle and chickens, and Josiah was impressed by how quickly she absorbed information about animal husbandry. "You have a natural way with animals," he observed as Evangeline gently stroked Thunder's neck. "They can sense when someone has a calm spirit. Animals are easier than people," Evangeline said. "They don't expect you to be something you're not." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Josiah made his decision. "Evangeline," he said quietly, "how would you feel about staying here permanently, being part of this family?" Evangeline was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky. "What if I have one of my spells?" she asked finally. "What if I can't do things the way you expect?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Josiah said. "I'm not expecting you to be perfect, Evangeline. I'm just hoping you'll let me be your father." The word father hung in the air between them. Evangeline had almost forgotten what it felt like to belong to someone, to have a person who cared about her well-being not out of duty but out of love. "I'd like that," she whispered. The legal process of adoption was simple in the Colorado Territory of 1847. A week later, Josiah signed the necessary papers at the courthouse in Millbrook, and Evangeline officially became Evangeline, Thornfield. Mrs. Hawthorne packed Evangeline's few belongings in a small carpet bag and walked her to where Josiah waited with his horse and wagon. "You be good for Mr. Thornfield," she said, giving Evangeline a rare hug. "And remember, you're a smart, capable girl. Don't let anyone tell you different." "Thank you for taking care of me," Evangeline said, tears threatening to spill over. "It was my privilege, child. You write to me sometimes, you hear?" The transition to life at the Thornfield homestead was not without its challenges. Evangeline had lived in the structured environment of the orphanage for so long that the freedom of her new home was initially overwhelming. She didn't know how to fill her days or what was expected of her. Josiah, recognizing her need for routine, worked with her to establish a daily schedule that incorporated both necessary chores and time for her interests. Mornings were devoted to animal care and garden work, afternoons to household tasks and reading, and evenings to whatever captured her attention. Structure isn't prison, Josiah explained when Evangeline worried that she was being too demanding. It's foundation. Everyone needs something solid to build their day on. Winter was particularly challenging. The isolation that Josiah found peaceful sometimes felt oppressive to Evangeline, who had grown accustomed to the constant presence of other people. Even if she didn't interact with them much, there were days when the snow kept them housebound, and Evangeline would pace the small house like a caged animal, her anxiety building until she couldn't contain it anymore. During one particularly bad episode, when Evangeline had been sobbing and rocking in the corner for over an hour, Josiah made a decision that would change both their lives. Instead of trying to calm her down or convince her to stop, he simply sat down beside her and began to rock in the same rhythm. Sometimes, he said quietly, the world gets too big and too loud, and we need to make ourselves small and quiet until it settles down again. After that, when Evangeline had her difficult moments, Josiah would simply sit with her until the storm passed. He never made her feel ashamed of her need for these quiet times, and gradually, the episodes became less frequent and less intense. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Evangeline threw herself into the garden work with an enthusiasm that surprised even Josiah. She had memorized Margaret's garden plans over the winter and had ideas for improvements and additions. Could we try growing some of the medicinal plants I read about? She asked. Echinacea for immune support, and chamomile for digestion, and feverfew for headaches. Josiah was impressed by her knowledge and encouraged her to expand the garden, according to her interests, as the plants grew under her careful tending. So did Evangeline's confidence and sense of purpose. The real test came when neighbors began visiting. The Thornfield homestead had been isolated during Margaret's illness and after her death, as Josiah had withdrawn from social contact. But as word spread that he had adopted a child, the community began reaching out again. Mrs. Patterson, who lived on the neighboring homestead, was the first to visit. She brought fresh bread and curiosity about Josiah's new daughter, Evangeline, who had been working in the garden. When Mrs. Patterson arrived, immediately became anxious about the unexpected visitor. Go inside if you need to, Josiah told her quietly. I'll handle the visit. But as he and Mrs. Patterson talked on the porch, Evangeline found herself listening from just inside the door. Mrs. Patterson was asking about Evangeline's background, her education, her suitability as a daughter for a respected member of the community. She's a fine girl, Josiah said firmly. Smart as a whip and works harder than most adults I know. She's got some particular ways about her, but don't we all? Well, of course, Mrs. Patterson said, but I heard in town that she was the problem child at the orphanage. Multiple families couldn't handle her. Then they weren't the right families, Josiah said, his voice taking on a protective edge. Evangeline belongs here, and anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to keep their opinions to themselves. From inside the house, Evangeline felt something warm and unfamiliar spread through her chest. No one had ever defended her before. No one had ever claimed her as theirs so firmly and without reservation. As the months passed, other neighbors visited, and each time, Josiah's response was the same. He acknowledged that Evangeline was different, but he presented those differences as strengths rather than deficits. Her attention to detail made her an excellent gardener. Her love of routine meant she was reliable and responsible. Her sensitivity to change meant she was observant and thoughtful. She notices things other people miss, he would say, and she remembers everything. Having her around has made me a better farmer and a better man. Gradually, the community began to accept Evangeline as part of the Thornfield family. Some neighbors remained skeptical, but others began to see her value. When old Mr. Henderson developed a persistent cough, it was Evangeline who suggested the right combination of herbs to help him heal. When Mrs. Rodriguez's vegetable garden was struggling, Evangeline diagnosed the soil problem and recommended solutions. By the time Evangeline's 12th birthday arrived in late summer, she had found her place in the world. She was still quiet and preferred routine, still got overwhelmed by too much stimulation or unexpected changes. But she was no longer the frightened, rejected child who had sat by the orphanage window. "I have something for you," Josiah said on the morning of her birthday, presenting her with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting to be filled. "I thought you might like to start keeping track of your plant observations," he said. Margaret always said that writing things down helped her understand them better. Evangeline ran her fingers over the smooth leather cover, speechless with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for seeing me the way I really am." "Thank you," Josiah replied, "for letting me be your father, for making this house a home again." As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, Evangeline reflected on the year that had changed everything. She had gone from being an unwanted orphan to being a cherished daughter. She had found not just a family, but a purpose and a place where her unique way of seeing the world was valued, rather than merely tolerated. In her new journal, she wrote her first entry: "Today I am 12 years old, and I am Evangeline Thornfield. I have a father who loves me exactly as I am, a home where I belong, and a garden full of growing things that depend on me to care for them. I think this is what happiness feels like." The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and with each passing year, the bond between Josiah and Evangeline grew stronger. She learned to manage her difficult moments with greater skill, and he learned to anticipate and accommodate her needs without making her feel burdensome. When Evangeline was 14, a new family moved to the area with a son named David who was close to her age. Unlike the other young people in the community, David seemed fascinated rather than put off by Evangeline's encyclopedic knowledge of plants and her intense focus on her interests. "She's remarkable," he told his parents after meeting her at a community gathering. "She knows more about healing plants than most trained doctors." The friendship that developed between Evangeline and David was unlike anything she had experienced before. He appreciated her mind, respected her need for quiet and routine, and never tried to change her into something she wasn't. "Do you think I'll ever be able to marry someone?" Evangeline asked Josiah one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "I think," Josiah said carefully, "that the right person will love you for who you are, not despite who you are. And I think that person will be very lucky to have you." By the time Evangeline turned 16, she had become known throughout the region as the girl who could cure almost any ailment with her herbal remedies. People traveled from miles away to consult with her, and she had begun teaching other women in the community about plant medicine. "You've found your calling," Josiah observed, watching her carefully prepare a tincture for a neighbor's arthritis pain. "I think Margaret would be proud," Evangeline said, using the name she had come to use for Josiah's late wife. Though she had never met Margaret, she felt connected to the woman who had first dreamed of adopting a child, who had planned the garden that became Evangeline's sanctuary, and who had filled the house with the books that fed Evangeline's hungry mind. "She would be more than proud," Josiah said. "She would be amazed by the remarkable woman you've become." As the sun set on another day in their quiet corner of Colorado Territory, Evangeline reflected on the journey that had brought her from the gray stone orphanage to this moment of contentment and purpose. She had been rejected by 7 families who couldn't see past her differences to the person she really was. But the 8th family, or rather, the 8th father, had seen her not as a problem to be solved, but as a gift to be treasured. In a world that often demanded conformity, Josiah had created a space where Evangeline could be authentically herself. In return, she had brought meaning and joy back into his life, healing the wounds left by loss and loneliness. Their story was not one of dramatic transformation or miraculous cure. Instead, it was a quiet testament to the power of unconditional love, patient understanding, and the recognition that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones that grow from choice rather than chance. As Evangeline closed her journal that night, she wrote, "Some people are born into families, and some people choose their families. I was lucky enough to be chosen by someone who saw my differences as gifts rather than flaws. In a world that tried to convince me I was broken, he showed me I was simply unique. And in learning to love myself through his eyes, I found the courage to become who I was always meant to be. The stars shone down on the Thornfield homestead, illuminating a family that had found each other against all odds, and a future bright with possibility. Over 90% of viewers watch, but don't subscribe. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe and support the channel. It means a lot. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.